You don't know the world you're living in.
Welcome to the future.
Welcome everybody, I am the Gadfly sent by God to rouse you from your slumber with another episode in the Lessons From series. This week is going to be about mysticism. Philosophically speaking, mysticism is a legitimate attempt to solve the problems of the human condition. My hope here is not to be religiously dogmatic, however. I think some religious traditions do it better than others, which you will understand why shortly, but like all the other videos in the Lesson From series, I'm not attempting to teach the specifics of certain mystic traditions, but rather I'm trying to tease out some of the most valuable things that these thinkers have come up with and apply them to our lives so that we can live better lives today in the current world in which we live. Let's get into it. From Pythagoras to St. Gregory of Sinai, and from Pseudo-Dionysius to St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, and all the Martin Bubers, Plotinuses, and Procluses in between, mysticism has been a valid method of philosophical and religious wisdom-seeking for several thousand years. The general aim of the mystic is to access knowledge and wisdom that is not typically accessible via sense data. In doing this, the mystic hopes to benefit himself by more fully embracing his existence. Usually the mystic believes that the typical methods of developing wisdom neglect or mischaracterize the role spirituality and phenomena not measurable by the senses play in the life of man. Some mystic traditions are more rigorous than others, and I think most are more harmful than helpful, by the way they tend to misdirect or mislead a person. Generally speaking, I think if your flavor of mysticism neither has specific, attainable goals nor tried and true methods, you end up running the risk of using vague bumper sticker slogans to guide your life and having nothing to achieve except losing, emptying, and destroying oneself into nothingness. The contrary is true, however, of a worthwhile mystical life. You gain illumination from short-sighted ignorance. You purify the mind and soul of slavish thoughts that tie you down, and you become united to, not absorbed by, the divine. With that being said, I think most people, atheist and religious alike, must consider the valuable resources given to us by the mystic traditions. The first of which permeates all mystic traditions, and that is that reality is to be experienced, not merely examined. If you live life trying to examine the phenomena around you, or within you, from a perspective of disinterested detachment, you become a spectator rather than a participant in your own existence. You reduce yourself to simply what you have done or what you have measured, rather than who you have been and how you have lived. Furthermore, existence is strange, and we find ourselves in the middle of that strangeness, participating in it, contributing to it, and trying to understand it. Given that we only know what it's like to be ourselves, the fact that everything we interact with is other than ourselves indicates that most of reality is in fact foreign to us. This is not solipsism, but it's the recognition that each of us lives his life from his own perspective, and we couldn't do it any other way. We might see patterns and similarities which help us navigate through it. Our practical sciences might allow us to make measurements of it and predict phenomena within it. But when it comes down to it, existence is frighteningly mysterious, and because of that, it would do us a good deal to immerse ourselves in that mystery. But this can be tough because mystery is hard to understand, and this is the second thing I believe the average person can learn from the mystics. That is, language cannot communicate our most subjective experiences. This is true for two reasons, I think. First, language by its nature universalizes. Subjective experience, however, is particular. When we speak, we put things into categories. We select that which we are talking about and deselect everything else. If I consider a chair, I have ruled out considering everything else from potato chips and baseball bats to blankets and tables, at least for that moment. Through language, the kaleidoscopic nature of reality gets divided up into neat categories, whose definitions are defined by their common attributes. This is the problem Plato ran into for which his solution was a realm of forms in which reality participates. This leads to an ideal form for all things, like chairs and trees and sheep. But common language is the same. What the mystics want to express to us is that some things are real which cannot be put into words. Certain experiences are so subjective and so particular that words for their existence do not and cannot exist. Wittgenstein alluded to this when he suggested that even if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. Likewise, the second reason I think that language is insufficient for expressing our reality is because language is limited. There are some things that cannot be expressed by language because language is communicative, but experience is experiential. These two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. The only thing I am suggesting is that there is not perfect overlap. Language is finite and bounded. This is not to suggest that experience is limitless, but it can, I believe, transcend the boundary of what we can say. This is a good time for me to make a note to the listener because it will explain what I have just said more clearly, and it will set a clear framework for what I am about to say after this. What I want to explain here is what Alfred North Whitehead calls the Reformed Subjectivist Principle. This is the idea that subjective experience is the primary metaphysical data which is presented to metaphysicians for analysis. It is reformed because it asserts that subjects experience other subjects only, whereas the classical subjectivist principle also suggests that individuals are the primary experiencers of reality. However, under this version, reality is unconscious and dead, mere sense data. Whitehead's metaphysics suggests that objects have a more primitive and decentralized consciousness than higher, more centralized beings like humans, and as such, there is no such thing as a concrete, non-experiencing object. It's not black and white, it's a matter of gradation. He calls that the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. For Whitehead, experience is the primary fundamental unit of reality. I will be dedicating an episode examining these ideas in much more depth, so subscribe to be notified for when that comes. But for today's discussion, simply understanding that subjectivity is the mode of experiencing reality is key. This allows me to examine the final lesson to be learned from mysticism, which I believe is that reality is relational. I don't mean to come across as New Age in saying that all reality is connected, but whether it is modern quantum science or ancient desert mysticism, the evidence suggests that to be is to be in relation. I'm trying to explain this in simple terms, but if you consider the last point, then you can see why putting this into clear terms is difficult. One way of stating this is to eliminate the idea of mere fact of existence and instead consider the act of existence. Each moment as time passes, I meet the world, and I continually meet the world with each new moment. Whether I choose to or not, reality presents itself to me, and I am presented within it. Being is a dynamic act of presence, says author W. Norrie Clarke. All real living is encounter. I am a part of the universe, and it is a part of me. Sure, I'm not completely the universe, and the universe is not completely me, but we share just enough commonality to be somewhat intelligible to each other. We live our lives inscrutably included within the stream and mutual life of the universe, Martin Buber says, indicating that my existence and the existence of the universe is mutual. That is to say, complementary and relational. In simpler terms, reality and I are in community. We live together and we affect each other. As I hope you can now see, mystics have long suggested that there's something real that we can't merely tell you about or plot on a graph for you. You have to experience it. You cannot speak about it intelligibly because it strikes us so deeply in our subjective personhood that words are too vague and too broad to capture the specificity of this experience. But we can relate to it. In fact, we have to, because it draws a red thread between us and the being around us, weaving us into a communion of being. It's not difficult, then, to understand why this mystical and mysterious reality has long been associated with the divine, or with God himself. In terms of logic and empirical analysis, this is one of the weakest arguments for God. In terms of subjective experience, it is one of the most powerful and ecstatic. Whether we're trying to become divinely illuminated or not, I think simply recognizing that everything we see might not be all that there is, and some things which are real are very difficult to express, can be very beneficial to our daily lives. We start to understand, as Socrates did, that we know a great deal less than what we think we do. We set aside our proud ego and begin to seek wisdom humbly and earnestly. Thanks for joining in. Like, share, and subscribe to stay notified, and join the discussion in the comments. I think this one is a unique episode so far, and I would appreciate supportive and critical feedback. Until next week.
They were meant to see, neither that or everyone else's.